Hello, everyone. I am Alice of KHR Arts and Cloud Orchid Publishing, and today we are going to talk about how I wrote my book, Geisha Hands. Now, this is a historical fiction novel. And what that means is that I take historical elements, such as the time period, the location, and cultural aspects that were all heavily researched within a fictional story, meaning that the characters and the things that happen in the story are fictional, they are made up, not real. This particular story is a Japanese historical fiction and it takes place during the Meiji period, which is the time period that's basically before World War II. And for those of y'all that are unfamiliar, the different periods in Japan are named after the name of the reigning emperor during that time period. The Meiji emperor, that's the time period. So there you go. So the reason why I chose this time period for my book Geisha Hands is because it's the time period when Japan was still very traditional. It was still very much what we think of when we think of Japan, but it is still modern enough that Westerners can still really connect with the characters and the story. Just from past experience with having conversations with people, it's oftentimes difficult for Westerners to really understand a lot of cultural stuff in earlier time periods, such as the feudal era. A lot of that stuff can be very confusing for them. So I wanted to pick a time period that was a little more familiar, but still had a lot of the authenticity. Whereas modern Japan, today's Japan, is very much this really cool amalgamation of the still traditions, the very traditional Japan, while also at the same time being this super ultra modern technology driven place. It's fascinating how they've been able to mesh these two things together. It's certainly admirable. I wanted to make this be a little more to the traditionalist side of Japan, which is why I chose that time period rather than a modern time period. And that's also part of the process of choosing what exactly you're going to write about when you write a historical fiction novel. Is it's not just about choosing a location, but it's also about choosing a location in time. And that's very important because it also limits what things that you can have in your storyline. So for example, this was so funny. When I was writing the manuscript for Geisha Hands, I was not yet in the editing process. I all of a sudden realized that the particular time period that I had chosen, and while the Meiji period is a rather large time period, I chose a much smaller time period that's before a lot of the modernization of Japan takes place because of World War II. During this time period, they don't have vehicles, they don't have cars. Their main mode of transportation is rickshaw. And my brain just completely glossed over that. And there were a few scenes where I talked about cars, and then I had to go back and change it because I realized there were no cars in Japan during that time period. Being aware of what time period you're choosing and making sure that you're staying true to that, especially in terms of innovation and inventions, just what things are available and are not available, is really important when writing historical fiction. Another big aspect to the history part of Geisha Hands is that I include footnotes and a full 40-page glossary at the back of this book for extra information. So yes, there is Japanese in this story. So some of the dialogue is in Japanese. There's a lot of Japanese words used to describe different objects and things, processes, cultural concepts, all that jazz. So I include those in the footnotes in the glossary, but I also include larger concepts in terms of history and culture with longer explanations in the glossary. And the reason why I did this is Geisha Hands is actually technically a combination of a story and a textbook, and that was done intentionally. I really wanted this to be kind of a bridge for this gap of Westerner understanding of Japanese history and culture, just to kind of give them a better window of understanding of some of these traditions in Japan. And as some of you may know, there are just an infinite number of traditions and aspects to Japanese history and culture. I could honestly fill an entire encyclopedia on all the information that I know, and I know that that is still just a drop in the bucket compared to what is actually out there that I have yet to have any sort of expertise or even basic knowledge in. It's just so incredibly vast because we're dealing with a culture that is literally thousands of years old. Always a wellspring of research for me, which I thoroughly enjoy, and that was another part of it for me was just the pure research. I enjoyed the research so much, y'all. I went down so many rabbit holes, and I had to really pull myself back and realize that we don't need 50 pages of information about the tools used for tea ceremony and other things like that, which is also where the glossary came in handy, where I was able to have some extra space to be a bit of a dork and share a lot of that information that I'm so passionate about and that I learned during this process. But traditionally, a lot of historical fiction novels do, at the very least, have some sort of addendum or appendix at the back of the book where it will talk a little bit about the textbook style information about the time period and the happenings that were written about in that particular book, as well as resources where people can learn more if they choose to do so. I basically kind of took that initiative on myself to kind of add all of those things to just readily at hand give that information to my readers by including a full glossary rather than just a small little appendix for them. And as well as narrowing the scope, as I said, there's just an infinite well of different topics that I could have talked about in this story. And I wanted to keep it more focused. With that, I focused on the Maiko and Geisha culture of that time period and the different traditions and cultural aspects that go with that particular aspect of Japanese culture and history. I mean, there's so much more out there, just incredibly so much more in terms of florists and ceramic artists and calligraphers and brush makers and farmers and just I could spend hours, y'all, listing off all the things. It's incredible. Having to really cut down my scope and really get specific and showcase one specific aspect was a really helpful thing in order to help keep this novel focused. And as I know that a lot of other people who are also history buffs, who are also really passionate about the cultures and the time periods that they are interested in, it can be hard sometimes to narrow your scope and really choose one or two things to focus on in your story because you have so much information that you want to share. And oftentimes, the best way to address that problem is just write more books. Write more books so that you can put all the information out there. At this time, I don't have any current plans to expand on Geisha Hands, but I'm sure that as I am inspired that that may or may not come in the future. I have a lot of projects that I'm working on right now, and a second or sequel of Geisha Hands is just not at this moment in the works. And a big part of that is not only did I do a massive undertaking in creating this story textbook style work, but I also included full color illustrations in this novel in order to better connect with the audience. And it took me a full 2 years just to create all of the illustrations in this book. It took me a full 3 years to research and write the manuscript, and then an additional 2 years to make all of the illustrations. There are 47 illustrations in this book, and I did all of them, as in I designed them, I planned them, and I drew them. It took a massive amount of work. The more simple illustrations took me about 3 to 5 hours, and the more complex illustrations took me as much as 30 hours to complete. So you can imagine, multiply that by 47. That is an insane amount of work. This book was hugely a product of passion, as you can guess from just the massive amount of research and effort that went into creating it. And that's a big part of why I decided to self-publish this through my publishing company, Cloud Orchid Publishing, is that, as I've talked about in some of my other videos, traditional publishers are not going to want to take the risk or the investment of time and money to create this kind of work. And this work is really so far removed from a traditional book in that not only does it contain full color illustrations, but it also requires custom formatting. My co-editor and best friend Brian Thompson and I spent 3 months on just the layout design for this book, going back and forth, deciding how exactly to present this information, the text, and these pictures in order to best present everything and make sure that the readability was as easy as possible. It was a ton of effort, and all of the customization that we had to do with the layout design is just not something that a traditional publisher is typically going to undertake. As well as I just was not willing to compromise. I was not willing to make any compromises with this work, and I'm so glad that I stuck to my guns and created this work as I envisioned, because it is truly an incredible work that I am so proud of, y'all. And every time that I see people pick this particular book up at conventions, they always are so impressed by this particular book. And that is what makes it so worth it for me, is that people immediately connect with and see the amount of work and passion that went into creating this book. Don't be afraid of going gung-ho on your passion projects, even if it's not a traditional project. You just never know who might connect with that. And in terms of creating this connection between the reader and the book, a big part of that is also making sure that you have relatable characters. And that was another really important thing for me in writing Geisha Hands, is that in a lot of books, especially historical fiction books, for some reason, I've noticed this to be a particular trope as well. It's also a problem in fantasy books too. So many times the main character is this overpowered person where they are just the most talented, the richest, the most famous, the bestest, whatever have you, the chosen one, all that kind of stuff. And there just really aren't a lot of stories in these genres that are just of average people being average and being okay with being average. And that's what I really wanted to illustrate with this, is that I especially feel that in this era of Instagram and Photoshop and just being assaulted with these unrealistic expectations in every facet of our lives, that I wanted to showcase a story about a character who is average, and she learns to be okay with being average, that there is nothing wrong with being average, that you don't have to be the best, the richest, the most famousest, the most talented, that you can be proud of being exactly who you are. That is what I wanted to promote with the main character. What exactly do I mean by this? The main character, Yuki, is a Maiko, which is an apprentice geisha. She is on the cusp of her Arike, which is basically the turning of the collar ceremony, where Maiko becomes a full geisha. And in that, she is kind of going through this whirlwind of her destiny is being set. That pretty much once she becomes a geisha, this is where the real game begins. That her ranking and her particular talent and all of that is going to be solidified. And pretty much kind of the markers for how the rest of her career are going to go are really determined by how things go for her Arike. And one of the biggest things that she struggles with during this is that there are two different kinds of geisha. There are the dancers and there are the instrument players, the musicians. And all of the dancers are typically the ones who are booked the most famous, all of that are the dancers, that a lot of times the musicians kind of get lost in translation compared to the dancers, which is really unfortunate. And I have read some amazing actual factual nonfiction stories about some incredibly famous geisha musicians and things like that. So don't get me wrong, they're not just completely ignored. It's just that when it comes to how bright a star shines for a musician, the dancers are always going to shine a little bit brighter. And that's just kind of a truth about that culture, unfortunately. And that's something that Yuki is struggling with, because she has basically been put on this track where she's a musician. Her talents are clearly in being a musician. She can dance. She's not horrible at it, but she's obviously like, you're a musician. This is the route we're putting you on. These are where your talents lie. And she's kind of struggling with that because she knows that she won't receive the same accolades that the dancers will. And so It's about her coming to terms with being accepting of her personal talents and realizing how special those talents really are and being okay with that. That she doesn't have to pretend to be something that she's not, that she doesn't have to throw away the talents that she has in order to pursue something that's just honestly completely unrealistic for her to pursue. And I think that that's an important message that a lot of people, especially younger people, really need to hear in this day and age. So I really hope that this book is able to reach people on that level and really give them the confidence in their own great talents, regardless of how average they may feel that their talents are. Lastly, it is an important thing for me to note, and it is an actual note at the beginning of my book in Geisha Hands that I do present in the first couple pages of the book, is that I 100% recognize that I am an American white woman of European descent writing a book about Japanese history, and that I can never understand Japanese culture and history on the same level as a Japanese American or a Japanese native born person. And so, of course, because of those circumstances, this work is technically flawed, and I fully embrace and recognize that. However, that I have worked so hard with doing the research in order to create this book as authentically as possible by injecting how passionate I am about this particular time period and culture, as well as that beyond this book, I have spent so many years just researching Japanese history and culture in general, just not even for a project, just because that all of that does go into this work. And that is first and foremost a big thing that a lot of writers really need to recognize when writing historical fiction, is that you really need to make sure that you do your due diligence and properly research the stories that you are telling. Even if it's not a historical fiction, even if it's a different genre, especially I've noticed some people are very guilty of this in the fantasy genre, that if you are referencing another culture, make sure that you are doing it accurately and you do your research. I've seen far too many people basically just take random things that they've seen in movies or on TV about overly generalized cultural concepts and then using that as fact in their books. And it's cringy to read. So I just want to put that out there as a disclaimer for y'all to always please make sure that you are doing your due diligence and working really hard to present an authentic work. And saying it's fantasy is not an excuse to basically just really loosely play with somebody else's cultures. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful. If y'all love historical fiction, whether you love to read it or write it, please let me know in the comments below. What are your favorite cultures and time periods that y'all like to write or read about? Tell me all about it because I want to know. Thank y'all so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye bye.